Most people assume the American Revolution ended cleanly. The colonies broke away, Britain signed the treaty, and everyone just moved on. But that's far from the truth. When you zoom out and look at the world at that moment, that version starts to feel a little too neat. Because in the late 1700s, Britain was the largest empire on Earth. A global power with ships in every ocean, colonies on every continent, and enough money and manpower to fight half the planet at once. And when an empire like that loses something as valuable as the American colonies, it usually doesn't just let it go. Yet Britain did. And it had so many chances of getting it back. Yet they didn't. Not in 1783, not in 1790, not in 1800, not even after the War of 1812, when British troops marched into Washington and burned the capital to the ground. So the obvious question is, why did the most powerful empire on Earth never make a serious attempt to take it back? And why did Britain, of all countries, accept defeat and move on? To understand it, you need to watch this video. Back then, there were no coast-to-coast borders, no sprawling cities, no railroads stitching the continent together. What existed instead was a long, narrow strip of settled land pressed between the Atlantic Ocean on one side and the Appalachian Mountains on the other. To the east was an ocean that took weeks, sometimes months to cross. To the west was dense wilderness, hostile terrain, and powerful Native American nations beyond British control. And in between lived a population that knew the land intimately because they had built their lives around it. Now, on paper, Britain had the world's strongest navy, a professional army, decades of combat experience, and an economy capable of sustaining long wars. On the other side was a loose collection of colonies with militias and limited resources. But maps have a way of humbling empires. Every British soldier and his equipment had to be shipped across the Atlantic at enormous cost just to reach the battlefield. The Americans, meanwhile, didn't even fight like a European army. They didn't defend territory the way Britain expected. They didn't rely on set-piece battles or fortified positions. Instead, militias spread into forests, crossed rivers they knew by heart, and struck where British control was weakest. Britain could take cities. It could seize ports. It could win battles, but it couldn't control the land in between, and that distinction mattered. For every stronghold Britain captured, it inherited miles of hostile terrain it couldn't effectively govern. The deeper British forces pushed inland, the more expensive and fragile their position became. Victory didn't bring stability, it brought responsibility, and responsibility drained the empire faster than defeat ever could. That was the first lesson Britain learned in America. But history rarely waits politely for one problem to be solved before introducing another. Because just as Britain was coming to terms with losing its American colonies, something far more dangerous began unfolding much closer to home. You see, the American Revolution formally ended in 1783, and the British had far more pressing matters across the English Channel now. Because less than a decade later, in France, a revolution exploded that dismantled an entire political order. What followed was chaos, war, and eventually the rise of a general who would redraw the map of Europe almost single-handedly. A man whose ambition would consume nations, exhaust empires, and drag most of Europe into conflict. Napoleon Bonaparte. For the first time in generations, Britain faced an existential threat not across an ocean, but just across the English Channel. Napoleon brought much of continental Europe under his control, and crucially, he aimed to break Britain's dominance at sea and, if possible, invade the British Isles themselves. Suddenly, every ship, every soldier, and every pound Britain could spare was needed in Europe. From London's perspective, the choice became brutally simple. Retaking America would mean reopening a costly, drawn-out war across the Atlantic. It would mean fighting on hostile terrain against a population that had already proven it couldn't be easily subdued. And it would mean doing all of that while facing the most dangerous military power Europe had seen in centuries. So Britain made a calculation. While Napoleon marched armies across Europe, Britain poured its resources into defending its homeland, protecting its trade routes, and preventing a single power from dominating the continent. The fate of a former colony, however symbolic, could not compete with the risk of losing the empire itself. By the time the Napoleonic Wars consumed Europe, America wasn't a wound Britain wanted to reopen. It was a chapter that, for the moment, had to stay closed. However, the British colonial greed would soon set its eye upon a new, richer host: India. Through the East India Company, Britain was already extracting wealth on a scale the American colonies had never come close to matching. Spices, tea, textiles, opium, and access to vast population centers flowed into British hands. Entire regional economies were being reorganized to serve imperial trade. By the early 1800s, the revenues generated through India dwarfed what Britain had ever earned from its former colonies in North America. And unlike America, India didn't require constant military occupation across thousands of miles of hostile countryside. Control was concentrated. Profits were predictable. Resistance, while real, could be managed without draining the empire's core resources. So, Britain adjusted. The empire that had once expanded through territorial pride began to operate through balance sheets. Decisions were no longer driven by wounded prestige or the desire to reclaim lost land. They were driven by return on investment. And by the early 19th century, America had already become a former asset whose cost now outweighed its value. And then came 1812. By this point, Britain was still locked in a life-or-death struggle with Napoleon. Europe was burning. Armies were clashing across the continent, and the fate of the British Empire was still very much undecided. It was in the middle of this global war that the United States made a bold and risky move. It declared war on Britain. For the British, this was an inconvenience, an irritation arriving at the worst possible time. America was opening a second front, while Britain was already fighting for its existence closer to home. And yet, even distracted and overstretched, the colonial veteran Britain proved something important. With only a fraction of its military committed to North America, British forces still managed to hit the young republic hard. American ports were blockaded. Trade was strangled. The US Treasury was crippled. And British troops marched deep enough inland to do the unthinkable. They burned Washington, the Capitol, the White House. The heart of the American government went up in flames. If Britain had ever wanted to reclaim the United States, this was the moment. America was vulnerable. Its army was small. Its infrastructure was limited. Its government was still finding its footing. And Britain had just demonstrated that it could strike wherever it wanted along the American coast. But it didn't try to stay. There was no attempt to occupy the country, no effort to dismantle the government, no plan to reassert colonial rule. Because by 1814, taking the US back would have meant years of fighting, enormous costs, and the near certainty of another prolonged insurgency across forests, rivers, and frontier settlements that Britain still couldn't fully control. And all of that would be required just as Britain was finally gaining the upper hand against Napoleon. So once again, Britain chose restraint. The War of 1812 ended with Britain walking away from its second chance to reclaim the United States. And when the guns finally fell silent in Europe in 1815, Britain had something it hadn't had in decades: peace. Napoleon was finally gone. For the first time in a generation, Britain could have looked west again and reconsidered the question it had postponed for so long. But the America it saw then was no longer the fragile former colony of 1776. In the years Britain had been fighting for survival, the United States had been growing rapidly, and in ways that fundamentally changed the calculation. Its population had surged. New states were forming. Settlers pushed beyond the Appalachians, carving towns and trade routes deeper into the continent. What had once been a narrow coastal strip was becoming a continental system. Geography, once Britain's obstacle, was now America's shield. The Mississippi River bound the interior together. The Great Lakes formed a natural northern barrier. Distance, forests, and scale combined to create something Britain recognized immediately, a landmass that could no longer be taken easily. And now, being adversaries was not an option. So Britain played it smart. It began to see it as something far more useful, a growing market. American farms fed British factories. American cotton powered British mills. British banks financed American railroads, ports, and industry. Trade flowed in both directions, faster and more profitably than it ever had under colonial rule. And crucially, none of it required occupation. Britain could profit from American growth without paying the cost of control. In fact, British investors made more money from the United States in the 19th century than the empire ever had from the colonies themselves. Geopolitically, interests began to align as well. Both countries benefited from stable Atlantic trade. Both opposed rival European powers, and both had more to gain from cooperation than conflict. By the mid-1800s, America was now a rising power whose success strengthened British interests rather than threatened them. The empire that once ruled America now made more sense as its partner. And once that shift happened, the question of reconquest disappeared for good. Because by then, the British Empire had reached the part of the story where power stops being emotional and starts being practical. The goal was no longer to rewind the clock and reclaim what was lost. The goal was to stay on top of a world that was changing fast, keep the trade moving, keep Europe balanced, keep the empire profitable, and keep the next crisis from becoming an existential one. The old empire didn't lose America the way people imagine. It released it into a different role, a former colony that grew into a customer, a rival that matured into a partner, and eventually a new power that could help Britain hold the very thing it cared about most, its position in the world.